Hello, I'm Allan Lee and welcome to NZONE Focus. Now this week we're continuing our series of interviews with leaders of the main political parties as we head into the general election, which of course will be held at the end of this month. Well, my guest this week is the leader of the ACT Party, Dr. Don Brash. Don, welcome to the programme. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
You're leading a party which will have pretty much a set of new faces by the time it gets to the election. Is that a concern?
Well, certainly it looks strange from the outside, and I acknowledge that. Of the existing 5 caucus members, none of them are planning to return to Parliament after this election. I had expected John Boscawen to return. He's the current parliamentary leader of the party, but he decided just a short time ago that he wouldn't stand for re-election. As he says, and one thing about John, he's absolutely straight up and down. He's totally honest. He said, look, it takes a huge amount of time, huge amount of pressure, and he said, I've got a family circumstance where I think I need to spend more time out of Parliament.
Were you disappointed?
Yes, I was, obviously. He's a very competent guy, made a great contribution to the party over 15 years.
Let's touch on the row recently over the legalisation or otherwise of cannabis. Was what the media said you said actually what you said?
I haven't looked at the transcript of the interview on Q&A, to be frank, but my speech on Sunday afternoon was in fact a text speech. I read the speech so that what I said is absolutely on the record. I mean, let's be quite open and frank about this. Marijuana does damaging things to brains, particularly young brains, and I don't want to imply that I'm in favour of that at all. I'm not. And that's very important that that's registered. But the question is, how do you deal with that most effectively? And there's some evidence that decriminalising it actually tends to lead to reduced usage of marijuana. The UK decriminalised in 2004. They had an increased usage initially, but then it fell off quite quickly. The Netherlands, where it's been legal since 1976, has a markedly lower usage of marijuana than we do in New Zealand. And my worry is not only that this having it criminalised isn't reducing consumption, because it drives the whole thing into the hands of the gangs, as indeed prohibition of alcohol did in the United States. It's the gangs that control the distribution. That gives them power, gives them money, and it gives them the ability to entice people into much more serious drugs. So I raise this as an issue. The country spends about $100 million a year on trying to prevent people using it. Notwithstanding that, very large numbers of New Zealanders do use it. And as I say, I'm talking about how do we minimise the harm done by what is quite clearly a harmful drug. I
suppose people would be concerned because they look at the way alcohol is treated. It's not criminalised, and as a result we have this binge drinking culture which is costing us millions and costing people their lives. I guess there's a concern that if we pull the brakes off completely, the same will happen with cannabis.
Well, I'm not sure that pulling the brakes off completely is the right way of describing what I would want to see. I'm told that in Portugal, the authorities can require marijuana users to go for treatment, for drug withdrawal treatment or whatever the expression is, and that it's a criminal offence not to go for that treatment if the authorities feel that you need to go there. And as I say, that's been part of the reason why their consumption levels have gone down quite markedly. I mean, I look at tobacco as another drug which is in many respects addictive and again has quite damaging effects on people's health. We've been able to change the culture around tobacco use, I think, very effectively. 20 or 30 years back, smoking was the cool thing to do. People smoked. I recall I was the director of the ASB Bank in the 80s, and at every board meeting there was a packet of cigarettes, an ashtray and a box of matches at every board place. Now, we didn't all smoke, but the presumption was that, well, most people did. Well, that's absolutely unheard of now. You wouldn't go into a boardroom anywhere in the country where that would happen. And I think we have changed the culture. Sadly, too much of the tobacco use is in a particular part of society, low income, frequently Maori, and we desperately need to work on getting that consumption down. So I'm not suggesting we just say, look, marijuana's fine, use as much as you like. But I'm saying that having it a criminal offence is really not working very effectively.
Of course, I mean, we saw John Banks reacted very strongly against it. As a voter, I would look at that and think, here's a party that can't agree even before an election, let alone afterwards.
Well, but I mean, there are many issues on which political parties are divided, and where members take a conscience vote. I mean, you think back to the Civil Unions Bill or Prostitution Reform Bill, drinking age, again, is frequently a conscience issue in most parties. Euthanasia, again, conscience vote. And I would expect an issue like marijuana to be a conscience vote in the ACT Party.
Let's go through some of the issues that we've been talking to all the leaders about. Research would seem to show that the traditional family unit of a mum, a dad and kids is the most successful way of raising young people.
Absolutely agree with that, by the way.
What can ACT do to support that family unit?
Well, I think one of the things which has caused the breakdown of the family unit, and I think there are two come to mind immediately. One was the change in the property, division of property after a marriage breaks down. My recollection, I can't recall the exact year, but the Labour government decided to provide those protections for people in de facto relationships. If you were in a de facto relationship for 3 years, you had the same protection exactly as you'd have if you were married. Well, I feel for people in de facto relationships which break up, but the fact of the matter is they have chosen to be in a non-contractual relationship. And I think that was one of the things which has reduced the attractiveness of marriage or the protection of marriage. There's no distinction between marriage and a de facto relationship. I think the other thing which has done enormous damage is the way the DPB has been handled. And we hear awful stories of young women, particularly unskilled and relatively uneducated women, who see the DPB and having children on the DPB as a valid way of deriving income. Now that's a disaster. And we know that a substantial number of children, particularly Maori children, are being born into single-parent families to the great disadvantage of the parent and the great disadvantage also of the children. And I think that's very sad. And one of the things the ACT Party feels strongly about is the need to reform the welfare system to reduce those incentives.
Helen Clark famously talked about her desire for New Zealand to be a kinder society. Have we become too kind a society? Is it possible to be kind and to look after the people who are having troubles?
I think it isn't in fact kind to incentivize people to behave in ways which are detrimental to both them and their children. That's not a kindness. It may seem like a kindness, but the reality is we're enticing people, incentivizing people into behavior which is ultimately very destructive of both them and their children.
Let's talk about jobs and employment, because I guess that's sort of linked, isn't it? There's a desperate shortage of jobs for young people. What's ACT's solution for that?
Well, it's partly because the Labour government abolished the youth minimum wage. When that was done in 2008, National Party members of Parliament said this will lead to higher youth unemployment. It has done. And one of the great concerns I have about the National Party is that the government has not reversed the move, which they said in 2008 would lead to more youth unemployment. Indeed, they voted against a members' bill, which Roger Douglas brought in, which would have reintroduced a youth minimum wage. Now, how much has youth unemployment gone up because of that? I don't know. But the Department of Labour suggests it's gone up between 4,500 and 9,000 young people. Eric Crampton at Canterbury University suggests it's gone up by 12,000. That's an appalling thing for young teenage New Zealanders who cannot get a job because of a government policy.
The Labour Party is suggesting that a scheme that involves, I guess, the old-fashioned apprenticeships and giving young people a chance when they leave college, if they're not earning, they should be learning, or vice versa. Would you support that sort of scheme?
Well, it's a palliative. I mean, Labour created this problem. Let's be clear about that. They created it. National failed to fix it. So now Labour's trying to desperately look around for things which might act as a sort of a band-aid, if you like. The key issue is that someone coming out of school at 16 with few qualifications maybe and no experience isn't worth the same as an adult at 24 or 25. And as long as we pretend they are, young people are not going to be in jobs.
What's ACT's position on state assets and the sale of them?
Well, I guess my position and ACT's position is, where is the evidence that governments run commercial businesses better than the private sector does? There isn't any, actually, not consistently. So we favour the sale of state assets where the company concerned is operating in a competitive market. I personally wouldn't sell, for example, Transpower. Transpower is the ultimate natural monopoly. I wouldn't sell that. But why would the government want to own 3 competing generators? I can't imagine why. People say, well, wait a minute, you're giving away a future stream of dividends. Well, of course you are. But the price at which you sell that future stream of dividends is the best estimate of what that stream is worth. You're not giving it away, you're selling it and investing the proceeds into other things which the state needs to do.
I suppose if people look at what happened with Telecom all those years ago, Telecom was sold off, and now we see those profits, which have at times been quite sizable, disappearing off overseas, and everyone thinks, well, those profits could be staying here in New Zealand.
But the price at which Telecom was sold, $4.25 billion back in 1990, when Helen Clark was Deputy Prime Minister, it's important to remind people, was $1 billion higher than the best estimate of what government thought they would get for it. So government got a lot of money up front. The value of the Telecom shares on the market right now is lower than the price at which the shares were sold if you adjust for inflation.
We'll come back and talk about that again in a moment. We'll take a quick break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. And welcome back to NZONE Focus, our interview with ACT Party leader Dr. Don Brash. Let's talk about free trade agreements, because that's something that's rearing its ugly or otherwise head at the moment. Particularly the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There are some concerns that the agreement that we appear to be rushing into will mean that Pharmac could end up being closed down, and all the advantages that brings us disappear. Effectively, American companies will be able to dictate to our government what they are or aren't allowed to do over something like, for instance, cigarettes. Are they a good thing, or are they a bad thing?
Oh, I mean, let me say, I'm a strong defender of Pharmac. I think Pharmac's been very good for the New Zealand taxpayer. Have got good prices from pharmaceutical companies. So I'd be concerned if we had to abandon Pharmac. Similarly, I think that we have to reserve the right to put health scares on tobacco packets. So I'd be very reluctant indeed to see us give those things away. At the end of the day, it'll be a trade-off between getting better market access to the countries involved in the TPP, one of which, of course, is the United States. And Tim Grosser, who is our Minister of Trade, of course, I've got a very high regard for. He's not going to give those things away lightly.
You have probably more experience than most politicians of the real world of economics, because obviously you were at the Reserve Bank with the SB. Are we making the right choices when it comes to steering through what appears to be a very stormy set of waters at the moment?
I think we've made some mistakes. I think the government has been unwilling to get on top of some of the sillier spending programs which Labor introduced in their last term of office. Labor was quite responsible, actually, through their first 5 or 6 years. They became quite irresponsible in their last term of office. Government spending is higher now than it was in any year under Labor, because National hasn't reversed that. We're borrowing $300 million a week, which is, I think, a worrying fact. That's keeping the exchange rate too high. No, we've made some bad decisions. Government recognised the problem, but they're just moving very slowly indeed to fix it.
Businesses are also very concerned about the emissions trading scheme. They see that as something that's not going to achieve much, but is going to cost them a heap of money. What's ACT's position on the ETS? Very
straightforward. We want to suspend the application of the ETS, or scrap it in fact, at least until our major trading partners have something similar. We produce 0.2% of global greenhouse gases. So our effect on climate, even if we assume that greenhouse gases are driving climate change, the effect that we have is minuscule. It's not clear why we should penalise our consumers and our producers by this tax when other people don't.
The environmentalists would say we need to do something, and if everyone says, oh, I'm going to wait for everybody else, we'll just end up with a planet that's choked.
Well, I mean, when National came to office in 2008, they said we should be fast followers, not world leaders. At the moment, we're the only country with an all gases, all sectors ETS. It's not clear why we should be doing that.
Our health system, is it working?
Well, it's working better than most people give it credit for, in the sense that if you have something serious happen to you, the New Zealand hospital system provides very good and very good quality care. So in that sense, it's working very well. But a recent study done on the productivity in that sector suggested that output per dollar spent and per person involved has actually been going down, and that's a worry. So I think there's still quite important things to be dealt with. For example, it's not clear why we need 20 district health boards. And a country with only 4 million people, that seems an awful lot of additional bureaucracy and pen pushers. So I think there does need to be further reform of that sector.
If we look at Britain, which has a huge health service, and ours, I guess, is as similar as most countries to the British National Health System, they're now making huge swinging cuts across the whole health sector. And that's causing real concern among people who are saying this is going to seriously affect health outcomes for British people. Would you see those sort of cuts here?
No, I don't. I think we have to become more efficient in the health sector. Funnily enough, I thought the national government of the 90s had it about right. They were saying, look, the taxpayer should be funding access to healthcare for everybody. But it shouldn't matter whether it's a publicly owned hospital or a privately owned hospital. Let's get the best price and the best quality we can for the taxpayer's dollar. And I think that was the right approach. But Labor reversed that. We've now got these, say, 20 DHBs, and I think that's a significant loss of efficiency.
The Bible tells us that we should look after our most vulnerable people, the widows and the orphans. Is that a position that ACT is comfortable with? Because I think many people's image of ACT is that
hard-nosed, hard-hearted.
That's it.
Exactly
that's
right.
it.
No, on the contrary. I mean, the founder of ACT was Roger Douglas, and Roger Douglas was all his career a Labour Party Member of Parliament. His father was, his brother was, and his motivation for setting up ACT was to help people on the low income, the people in Otara, people in Mangere. He tried to get me to stand in the Te Taikaro by-election. Why? Because he wanted to show that the ACT Party has policies absolutely relevant to poor Maori in Northland. In the end, we decided not to for a variety of reasons. But we're absolutely motivated to help low-income people. High-income people, to a large extent, look after themselves. But helping low-income people is about the economy getting to work properly, getting taxes under control, getting government regulation under control, so that everyone can get a job.
So is this an image problem for ACT?
Because yes, it is.
How do you combat
that? Well, you have to keep on talking and explaining, and using programs like your own, thank you very much, to explain that fact.
Do you think that the 3 strikes policy is working? Because
yes, I do.
We seem to have a very draconian system. We have more people in prison than almost any other OECD country per capita.
That's absolutely correct. But this is not an American type 3 strikes policy. In California, you just about go to lifetime jail for stealing a comb or stealing an apple. This is not that. This is for people who commit serious, violent, or serious sexual offences. And in the first strike, it's a regular sentence. Second strike, you serve the whole sentence with no parole. The third strike, you get the maximum penalty for that offence. But it has to be serious offences, and we think having those people out of the streets and out of people's homes is a beneficial thing to have done. We feel good about it.
But in terms of the rates of incarceration in New Zealand, that would seem to imply that we were doing something wrong if so many people are going to prison. It's such a high percentage. Surely we should be looking at restorative justice or some other means of punishment that doesn't put so many people in prison, because it's very expensive.
Or look at what causes this crime. And that is a fault of the education system. Too many people coming out of school without being able to read and write, helpless, hopeless, no job prospects. That's one serious problem. And a welfare system, which again incentivizes people not to work if you haven't got many skills. And what we say, look, fix the welfare system, fix the education system, and to a significant extent, we will reduce the crime rate.
Would you go with national standards in education?
On balance, I was in favour of that, but what the ACT Party is really saying is, let's give parents more choice about where to send their children to school. Let the funding follow the child, as it does at preschool and at tertiary. Why doesn't that work at primary and secondary?
How would that work within a system that is already up and running? Because it seems that every practically every government that comes in changes the system from the last government that came in. The schools must feel that they're on a roundabout that never lets them off.
Well, it's a very important issue for many people, but I'm impressed by the fact that a place like Sweden, which is not seen as a hard right conservative country, has given parents a lot more choice about where they send their children to school. We think that it's a good model. We think the British Conservative Party is interested in the same kind of reform. We think that could work very well here too.
Let's talk a bit about MPs. British MPs, we had that huge, expensive scandal. It was very embarrassing. We have a couple of MPs who've ended up in prison here in New Zealand. Is there a case to be made for MPs to give some sort of moral leadership to the rest of us?
Oh, I think they're expected to do that, and I think to a large extent they try to do that. I mean, you referred to a couple of MPs in jail, I think only one, and that was the first time in New Zealand history where any MP was jailed for on a corruption charge. Now that's a pretty remarkable record, and compared with most other countries, it's a very good record. But I mean, MPs are very acutely conscious of that kind of potential for scandal, and I think most of us try very hard to avoid it.
Is it hard when you're an MP to keep things in perspective? Because I mean, I know from talking to politicians on a fairly regular basis that they start work early, they finish work late, they're in a pressure cooker environment at the Beehive. When they're back home, they're always being buttonholed by constituents who are wanting them to do stuff for them. Do politicians actually lose touch with what the rest of us are doing?
I think there's a danger of that without doubt. Not only do they work very long hours, certainly the major politicians do, but in addition, the people they come in contact with are often people who are trying to ingratiate themselves with the politician for one reason or another. And they say, look, you're a fantastic guy, the country needs you, you're the most important thing since sliced bread. And after a while, you actually begin to believe it. And it's a very dangerous thing. You can get an ego problem if you are long in that game. I don't think I've got that, but it's a real occupational risk.
In the event of a coalition being formed, who can you work with, or probably more interestingly, who can't you work with?
Well, I mean, we've said publicly already that we would do a confidence supply agreement with the National Party. People have expressed surprise at that, but realistically, there's no other party at this point that we could form a coalition deal with. Now, there are things we want to achieve from that, but a John Key-led government is what we would be expecting to support after the election.
Would you be able to work with possibly other coalition members, for instance, say the Māori Party or the Greens?
Well, it's funny enough, after the 2005 election, when I was leader of the National Party, I talked with the Māori Party, funny enough, at Rodney Hyde's encouragement, on some areas of policy, particularly around educational choice and around the need for welfare reform. The ACT Party and the Māori Party have issues in common. On issues of the Constitution and one law for all, we're 100 miles apart. So I guess it's a question of finding the issues where we can work together, while there's some issues we clearly cannot work together on.
It'll be an interesting time, Dr. Brash. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme.
Thank you.
That brings our programme to a close for this week. We look forward to seeing you again at the same time next week when I'll be talking with Labour leader Phil Goff. Hope to see you then.